I wrote him a letter in which I said it's a wonderful book, Fackenheim tells me, but it's only half the story. Half the story? The story of the survivors is half, but I told him, now you have to write a book about the something. About the what? I said, not making out his last word because of his still pronounced Central European accent. About the criminals, the Nazis, the murderers, he exclaimed, looking at me to see if I was deaf. You know, Hitler. But really knowing Hitler was a kind of peril, Desprez warned Fackenheim. He wrote me that the way to try to understand them is to identify with them, and the danger is you might like them. No, become like them. So he said he refused to write about the criminals, as a lot of people have. And one particularly shocking case is that fellow David Irving, who wrote volumes about Hitler's war because he sympathized, and later, of course, became pro-Nazi. This is the danger once you try to explain it. If there's a peril to empathy, a danger of explanation, the counterpart, he told me, is the danger of objectivity. If you try to explain it clinically like Hannah Arendt does, the more you detach yourself, you can collect all the objective facts you want and explain less and less. He cited a good German historian, Jekyll, who has a chapter which refers to the biological insanity of the Nazis. That explains absolutely nothing. Insanity is the smallest explanation of what went on. How then does one, how then did Fackenheim avoid this Scylla and Charybdis of empathy and objectivity? You have to make a double move, he told me. A double move? Fackenheim then introduced a remarkable notion that reveals, if nothing else, how fraught the very idea of explaining Hitler is for him and for us. There has to be an epistemological rejection, a resistance to explanation, he insists. The double move, then. Use the technique of empathy to understand the processes that produce evil in Hitler, but at the same time resist the idea that an explanation can explain away his personal responsibility for evil. I read people like the Auschwitz commandant Rudolf Hess, he says by way of example. Hess is the author of memoirs called Death Dealer. Hess is full of self-excuses, and all of them are lies, but I'm not sure whether he's conscious of the fact they're lies. But resisting the sincerity of Hess's self-explanation was just a warm-up, he told me. Then, finally, with a deep breath, I read Mein Kampf. In fact, Fackenheim does not sound as if he experienced much difficulty in finding reasons to resist empathy with the Hitler of Mein Kampf. He seems to have first seized on Hitler's claim to be what Fackenheim really is, a philosopher in the grand tradition. Hitler's assertion in Mein Kampf that he possessed what post-Kantian German philosophy exalts above all else, a Weltanschauung, a comprehensive, philosophically consistent worldview. The book is also self-inflating, Fackenheim says contemptuously, but especially so when he says he found his Weltanschauung in Vienna. What does this mean? How did he find it? He became suddenly a philosopher in his own mind, and a kind of philosopher that has a Weltanschauung and everything fits. Never again would Hitler doubt. But Fackenheim's certainty on this question is not shared by all Hitler explainers. The issue of whether Hitler did have a coherent worldview, an ideology, if not a Weltanschauung, has, like every other issue in Hitler studies, become a battleground. The 70s saw the emergence of two opposed schools of Hitler explanation. There was the psychohistorical, which explained Hitler's actions as pathological irrationality, the product of mental disease, if not madness. And there was the ideological school, which attempted to demonstrate that Hitler's actions could be construed as logical, in the sense that they proceeded from a coherent structure of beliefs, a Weltanschauung, and responded to a coherent, if wicked, analysis of actual German historical realities and an accurate assessment of the sentiments of the German populace. Many of those who attempt to make this case are German Hitler explainers, but not all. J.P. Stern, for instance, the Czech-born British historian, who heard Hitler as a boy in Munich and escaped to England with his Jewish family in 1938, is one of those who took issue with Fackenheim's dismissal of Hitler's intellectual pretensions. In Hitler, the Führer and the People, 1974, Stern contended, "The attempt to offer a fuller understanding of the Hitler myth does involve a new look at his intellectual equipment. With fuller evidence of his studies in Vienna and Munich, it becomes clear that, to quote Bullock's phrase, to speak of Hitler as a moral and intellectual cretin is no longer justified." There is still a gulf, of course, between saying Hitler is not an intellectual cretin and crediting him with a coherent philosophical world view. But Fackenheim has no doubt on that question. He calls the notion Hitler had a Weltanschauung a transparent lie. But the big lie in Mein Kampf, the biggest lie about Hitler, Fackenheim believes, is the one he told about himself and the Jews. Not the obvious lies about Jewish evil. No, this was one of those moments in my conversation with Fackenheim in which one of his observations pulled the rug out from under certain familiar ways of thinking about Hitler to reveal not a floor but an abyss of uncertainty beneath. It occurred to me that this is why people used to pay attention to philosophers. He broached the subject of the biggest lie by recalling something once said about Hitler's final words, his deathbed testament, which Fackenheim believes was actually his final defining lie. "You know Robert Waite's book?" he says, referring to Waite's psychohistorical study, The Psychopathic God, Adolf Hitler. "It's a very good book," Fackenheim told me, "but I think he made a few mistakes. One thing Waite says is, nobody goes to his death with a lie." Nobody goes to his death with what? With a lie! What Waite actually wrote is that the deathbed testament is the quintessential Hitler. Waite, Fackenheim explains, makes this remark in discussing Hitler's famous final testament, the one he wrote in the bunker before his suicide, the one in which, even in the midst of the destruction he'd brought upon his own people with his war against the Jews, Hitler enjoins them and their successors to continue the war to the death with the eternal poisoners of the world, the Jews. So, therefore, since Hitler went to his death with his famous testament of hating Jews, that must have been the true Hitler. But it's completely false. I mean, it may be the case, but it may have been that Hitler, who posed all his life, who could never believe anything until he had the crowd before him to cheer him, went to his death like an actor, for posterity. In other words, Hitler's deathbed testament was a big lie to maintain his pose of authenticity, the pose as a crusader who died for a passion he believed in, rather than a failed opportunist who believed in nothing but his own ambition and used Jew hatred to advance it. Hitler as actor. Actor as in liar, cynic, mountebank, whose biggest lie was that the apparent utter authenticity of his passion, which J.P. Stern calls the source of his appeal, was never real, only calculated. Hitler as an Iago, whose motiveless malignancy was all cynically manipulative sleight of hand, not even faintly redeemed by a sincerity, however pathological. Look at his marriage, Fackenheim continues. His wedding half an hour before his death. What does that mean? It was all a performance, says Fackenheim, who later told me he had no doubt Hitler was a strange sexual pervert. The deathbed marriage was then also a lie, theatrical from beginning to end. I asked the implicit question, "Are you saying he didn't even believe in his anti-Semitism?" I don't think he knew the difference between acting and believing. He goes on to recall a detail from one of the Hitler crony memoirs, the fact that Hitler would pose before a mirror before his speeches. He cites footage of an early rally in which Hitler started out with a questioning look, and then he gets sincere approval, and then relaxes and smiles. Here was a man who was considered a nobody when he was with private people, especially women, and became a big god in front of the masses. The public Hitler, he maintains, was a joint creation of actor and audience. Of course, Fackenheim adds in a devastating fillip, it's a shocking thing to consider that 6 million Jews were murdered because of an actor. What I found particularly shocking coming from Fackenheim was not just his belief that Hitler's hatred of the Jews wasn't sincere, but his almost casual dismissal of any certainty on the question. The deathbed testament is completely false, he said first, and then added, it may be the case. In other words, we have no basis for knowing one way or the other. For the foremost post-Holocaust Jewish philosopher and theologian to assert that after a half-century we still can't come even to this basic conclusion about Hitler's thought world was stunning enough when I first heard it that afternoon in Jerusalem. But it was only a year later, after a third reading of the transcript of my talk with Fackenheim, that I began to understand what was really behind the black-humored irony of that remark about 6 million murdered because of an actor. It was Fackenheim's ultimate effort to rescue Hitler from explanation, to preserve him for evil. By characterizing Hitler's apparently implacable hatred of Jews as merely an actor's trick, by thus denying him the virtue of passionate sincerity, or the pity perhaps due to a victim of a pathological mental disease, Fackenheim deflects, even derails, one entire project of Hitler explanation, the focus on finding the psychological source of the white-hot virulence of Hitler's hatred of the Jews, by contending that the passion was not white-hot, but pure, cold, calculated invention. And thus, all the more evil. Evil for evil's sake. Evil inexplicable by pathology or ideology, and all the more inexcusable. Radical evil, a term Fackenheim uses to define a phenomenon that goes beyond the quantity of the victims, a new category of evil. While it might seem at first glance not terribly controversial to call Adolf Hitler evil, Fackenheim was the first to make me aware of a fault line in the Hitler literature, the surprising reluctance of those who have written about him to consider Hitler himself as consciously evil. The argument against explaining away evil in Hitler is central to Fackenheim. His notion of radical evil, which is not the same as Arendt's or Martin Buber's use of the term, differs from the traditional Jewish conception of evil, which postulates not an absolute principle, but an evil inclination within that can be overcome. It differs from the traditional Christian conceptions of evil, which vary from defining it as non-being, the absence of good, to personifying evil in a demonic personage, as the Prince of Darkness struggling for possession of the soul. Fackenheim's notion of radical evil differs in that it is not contingent on, not the result of, a struggle within the human soul, but the kind of evil that can never be overcome, evil that is transcendent, unsurpassable, absolute, as one commentator on Fackenheim describes it, evil that cannot be explained away, even atoned for, but can only be resisted by its victims, however hopelessly. One problem with Fackenheim's argument, the problem with others who, like him, strenuously argue that the evil of Auschwitz is absolutely unique, never before committed or experienced, is that it can seem to issue from a kind of inverse narcissism. My evil, the evil I suffered from, is worse than your evil, worse than his evil, any other evil. This can lead to tortuous ratiocination devoted to proving that, for instance, the Armenian genocide falls short, or the Stalin-inflicted famine and slaughter is less worthy of uniqueness, a preoccupation with comparative demonology that divides rather than unites victims of evil, and can absolve the actual perpetrators of responsibility. The insistence on the Holocaust's uniqueness and inexplicability, Elizabeth Domansky wrote of this position in the journal History and Memory, allowed the West Germans to see the Holocaust as something that could not be explained even in the context of the Third Reich. The Holocaust thus is transferred to the realm of the ahistorical, and thus renders the question of responsibility obsolete. Still, Fackenheim's insistence on the absoluteness of Hitler's evil defines one pole of the debate. It helps explain Fackenheim's resistance to the very idea of explanation. Explanation, in Fackenheim's view, if not evil itself, nonetheless can verge on ameliorating, excusing, even colluding with evil. Which brings us to Fackenheim's point of attack on the Hitler explanation enterprise, the Jewish blood crux. That was the next firecracker this contentious philosopher threw across my path that afternoon in Jerusalem. His peculiar take on this disturbing strain of Hitler lore, the attempt to explain Hitler's hatred of Jews as a form of self-hatred, as a product of the maddening doubt he had about his own racial identity. While more sophisticated versions of this long-standing but still outre and disturbing notion have been gathering adherents since the 70s, particularly among psychoanalytically oriented Hitler explainers, I was surprised to find Fackenheim not resisting but almost embracing it as an explanation, until I saw how he turned it into the spear point of his attack on explanation itself. The subject arose when I asked him about Milton Himmelfarb, and he responded with a story about a playmate of Heydrich. "What is your view of the statement, 'No Hitler, no Holocaust'?" I asked him, in regard to Himmelfarb's insistence that Hitler's personal will alone, rather than abstract historical forces, was the necessary if not sufficient factor in making the Holocaust happen. "Is that Milton Himmelfarb? Yeah, I think he's probably quite right. Although I recently wrote there might have been one exception. Heydrich could have done it. And that strikes very close to home. I came from the German town of Halle, and when I had to write my memoirs, which aren't complete yet, I entitled the first section about Halle, 'From Georg Friedrich Handel to Heydrich.' And did you know that for 3 weeks my mother lived under the same roof where Heydrich played? Really? Because when Kristallnacht happened and I was at school, my brother and my father were taken away, my mother was all alone. Our best friends asked her to move in with them, the Levines. Their daughter, Ilse, was just visiting me. Well, Kurt Levine was the only Jew in the whole city who wasn't taken, because he was protected by his neighbor Heydrich. So I just asked Ilse Levine recently, 'Did you know Heydrich when you were younger?' She said, 'Oh, sure. He came to our house all the time. When his sister was in trouble with her parents, we used to look after her.' And it shocks you absolutely, because Heydrich was reputed to be the only man who could have followed Hitler. Incidentally, about Heydrich, they also say that he had a Jewish ancestor. More than incidentally, many accounts of the life of Reinhard Heydrich, the evil young god of death, portray him as a kind of double doppelganger of Hitler. He was a twin in the fanatical single-mindedness of his drive to exterminate the Jews. He was, after all, the man to whom Hitler entrusted the planning and execution of the final solution until Heydrich's assassination by Czech partisans in 1942. But also like Hitler, Heydrich was rumored to have had a special Jewish doppelganger haunting him, a shadowy alleged Jewish ancestor, rumors of whose existence gave rise to the widespread reports that Heydrich felt personally plagued by a putative Hebraic shadow. To some, then, Heydrich was not only a potential successor to Hitler, he might be a possible explanation, in the sense that his struggle with this Jewish blood shadow might be a clue to a similar dynamic in Hitler's psyche. Rumors about Jewish blood pursued Heydrich from Halle to the Naval Academy at Kiel, where fellow midshipmen are reported to have taunted him as Issi Süß, Süß being a derisive surname of caricatured Jews. Followed him even into the SS when Himmler put him in command of its intelligence division, the SD, in 1932, a post that would later lead to his being given command of the Gestapo in 1934. Heinz Höhne, the historian of the SS, cites a communication from a local Gauleiter, regional party leader, in Halle, who wrote to party headquarters in 1932, "It has come to my ears that in the Reich leadership there is a member named Heydrich. There are grounds for suspecting that Bruno Heydrich of Halle, said to be the father, is a Jew." Höhne reports that although no solid evidence was found in a subsequent investigation, the higher Reinhard Heydrich climbed on the National Socialist ladder, the more persistent became the rumor that he was of Jewish origin. In a memoir, a League of Nations official who came to know Heydrich reported a probably apocryphal but nonetheless representative story. Heydrich had become so tormented by the fear of the Jew within that one night, in a drunken fit, he stared into a mirror, thought he actually glimpsed the shadowy Jew within somehow emerge in his reflection, and promptly fired his pistol into the mirror image, hoping to extinguish it. Unable to extinguish the doubt about a Jew within, the logic of this theory goes, Heydrich had to prove his purity by engineering the extermination of the Jews of Europe. One reputed source of this theory was none other than Heydrich's boss, Himmler. Fackenheim cites Himmler's belief that Heydrich's devotion to the final solution came from the fact that he had overcome the Jew in himself and had swung over to the other side. He was convinced that the Jewish elements in his blood were damnable. He hated the blood which played him so false. The Führer could really have picked no better man than Heydrich for the campaign against the Jews. Despite the fact that these thoughts of Himmler come to us from his only sometimes reliable confidant, the Monsieur Felix Kirsten, Fackenheim believes their essential truth. "You know, Ilse said this too," he told me, referring to Ilse Levine, whose home was spared Kristallnacht because the young Heydrich had frolicked there as a child. "She thinks the Jewish blood rumor is true. She knew, of course, Heydrich's father very well. He looked very Jewish, and he ran a conservatory of music." In fact, both Heydrich and his father were highly accomplished violinists, but according to my own analysis of the multiple, overlapping, and conflicting accounts of the Heydrich Jewish blood question, the truth might be more absurd and ironic than even the presence of actual Jewish blood in this architect of the final solution. It seems Bruno Heydrich had a stepfather who, although impeccably Aryan, bore the stereotypically Jewish name Süß. A perhaps malicious music world rival, compiling an entry for Bruno in a directory of Germany's musical elite, went out of his way to make it appear that Bruno's last name was Süß, as it apparently had been for a time when growing up in his stepfather's house. Much as Hitler's father's surname for the first 40 years of his life was Schicklgruber, after his unmarried mother's surname, Adolf's never was. And it also seems that Bruno's strategy for deflecting the whispers about his heritage proved to be a self-defeating one. He was known to do a mean comic Yiddish accent at parties, perhaps to demonstrate he had nothing to fear or hide. If so, this penchant of his for play-acting the Jew backfired. The more he did his Jewish impressions, the more he fostered the impression he really was a Jew. The irony is that Reinhard, Bruno's son, fit every criterion Nazi racial science had established for pure Nordic appearance, but was shadowed, plagued, perhaps even turned into a mass murderer, by a rumor based on his father's comic impressions. Of course, irony is an inadequate term for the idea that such horror could grow from such origins. In discussing this and the idea that a similar spectral struggle with the phantom Jew underlay Hitler's obsessive hatred, we have gone beyond conventional irony. We are really in Kafka territory again. Fackenheim's take, his double take it might be called, on the Jewish blood explanation of Hitler and Heydrich, is a concession to Kafka as description, but a resistance to Kafka as explanation. Fackenheim first addressed the question in his 1982 work To Mend the World, where he took up Robert Waite's formulation of the Jewish blood theory. Waite's thesis, Hitler needed to exterminate the Jews to exterminate his doubts about a Jew within himself, supplies solutions of sorts to problems which otherwise would seem totally intractable. Fackenheim writes, "Why did Hitler attack Russia, thereby willfully creating the long-dreaded, unnecessary two-front war? Why did the plan to remove the Jews turn into a vast system of murder, more important than victory?" To such questions, psychohistory gives more plausible answers than either psychology without history or history without psychology. Having thus set up Waite's theory as the best of all possible explanations, Fackenheim then subverts any complacency about its having really explained Hitler. It gives its answers, however, only at the price of raising still more intractable questions. Quoting Herbert Lutey's 1954 commentary essay, he asks, "How shall one reconcile the gravity, the catastrophic magnitude of the event with the vulgar mediocrity of the individual who initiated them?" These questions, Fackenheim goes on to declare, assume a dimension of utter absurdity. Were 6 million actual non-Aryans and many additional honorary ones butchered and gassed because the Führer hated his father and thought of him as a half-Jew? The disproportion between absurd cause and catastrophic effect is unbearable. Waite's thesis, then, is defective precisely because it pretends to the possibility of plausibility. The more plausible psychohistory becomes, the more it points to an ultimate absurdity. Fackenheim writes, "The mystery remains. Utter absurdity, ultimate absurdity, the abyss between the horror of the tragedy and the near-comic absurdity of the explanation, in other words, the illogic of the Kafkaesque, the rationale of irrationalism." Fackenheim both accepts and resists the Kafkaesque as Hitler explanation. The absurdity might be true, but it is not enough. Fackenheim dismisses the best of Hitler explanations in the same way Theseus dismisses the absurd clowning of the mechanicals play in A Midsummer Night's Dream. The best in this kind are but shadows. All actors are bad actors if they aspire to give us the truth of the world. Similarly, all explanations are bad explanations if they aspire to give us the truth of Hitler. Any explanation, however plausible in human terms, that pretends to proceed logically from comically finite human psychological sources to the tragic infinitude of the horror of the camps is prima facie absurd, Fackenheim seems to be saying. Fackenheim's almost visceral repugnance at the absurdity of explanation is a rejection of Kafka as the author of history, of the idea of God as Kafka. Still, Fackenheim recognizes that his unwillingness to see God as Kafka opens the way to the even more unthinkable notion Yehuda Bauer had broached, God as Satan. The mystery remains, Fackenheim says. The usual suspects have been rounded up and found wanting. The unusual suspects, a spectral Jew here, a medical mesmerist or a billy goat there, have been arraigned and dismissed for lack of evidence, leaving only the prime suspect standing, the prime mover, God himself. Fackenheim's courage lies in following the logic of his attack on explanation, in following the logic of monotheism to frame an indictment of the God of monotheists. The refusal of God to speak in his own defense, his refusal to take the stand, so to speak, at his own trial, cannot be ignored by those who profess to believe in or worship him, Fackenheim insists. Caution rather than courage, however, is evident in how Fackenheim structures what might be called the jury deliberation process in the trial of God. Elie Wiesel is famous for a stunning image of what might be called the capital punishment of God. For having described in Night the horrific spectacle of a young boy hung from the gallows by the death camp guards, and for having cried out that the hanged boy dying in the noose was, for him, God dying to him. In a Yom Kippur 1997 essay, Wiesel wrote that after half a century he wanted to make up with the God he abandoned on the gallows, although Auschwitz must and will forever remain a question mark that no theological answers have yet explained. Fackenheim wants to get God down from those gallows. His vision of a God who was not a commanding presence in the death camps, but a silent one, is somewhat more complex than Yehuda Bauer had it when he caricatured it as a God who is present and cries with you. Rather, Fackenheim recuperates God's presence in the acts of heroism, endurance, love, and faith the inmates of the camps manifested in the face of radical evil. He calls this the commanding voice of Auschwitz, the voice that forbids posthumous victories to Hitler. But Fackenheim himself does not argue that this notion of a silent presence resolves the mystery of God's shift to silence when those who prayed to him were most massively in peril. It's just that the alternative is, to Fackenheim, intolerable. Intolerable not so much because it would mean acceding to Bauer's syllogism, in which God is either Satan or Nebish, but because that accession, that dismissal or rejection of God by Jews, will have, in effect, been dictated by Adolf Hitler, giving Hitler in death the ultimate victory over the Jews he was denied in life, an extermination of belief more complete than the extermination of believers. For Fackenheim, I believe, to give in to the stark logic of Yehuda Bauer's syllogism, if God is all-powerful, he permitted the Holocaust to happen, in effect caused it, is to make God Hitler or Hitler God. It was Fackenheim's revolt against this impossible dead-end choice, his revolt against letting Hitler dictate what Jews believe about God, that led him to conceive of his 614th commandment. A dictum I hadn't fully understood until that afternoon in Jerusalem, when he gave me a dramatic description of the moment he confronted the unbearable gravamen of the evidence for the case against God, and how he came to formulate his famous 614th commandment about Hitler as a kind of limiting instruction to the jury. It was April 1967, just after Purim, a holiday celebrating Jewish deliverance from slaughter, but one that found Fackenheim sickened both physically and spiritually by the sudden cloud shadowing the future of the Jewish state. With Egyptian President Nasser about to blockade Israel's ports, a growing threat of the three-front attack to come, with the world indifferent if not hostile, it looked to Fackenheim as if a second Holocaust was in the works. There was a symposium in New York on Purim, which coincided with Easter, and I was morally pressured by a friend of mine to participate. I had never written anything about the Holocaust before because it was too frightening. And not only that, among the other participants was Elie Wiesel, and I held him in great awe. It was a real crisis moment, and I knew it myself because I was sick before. Sickened by the prospect that God could permit a second Holocaust, he says, "That was the crisis where I first put forward the 614th commandment. Jews are forbidden to grant posthumous victories to Hitler." It's a commandment whose power I'd long felt, but the implications of which I had questioned, or, as I came to feel after listening to Fackenheim describe its genesis, misinterpreted. A commandment designed to deny Hitler a certain kind of power that I'd misinterpreted as, in some perverse way, restoring to him another kind of power. Think about it. Its implications are obvious and non-problematic if one takes it to mean one should resist and combat anti-Semitism, neo-Nazism, and other manifestations of Hitler-like hatred in order to deny Hitler and Hitlerism a posthumous resurrection and life. But on the other hand, as a habit of thought for Jews, for anyone, it paradoxically could be seen giving Hitler a continuing life, a defining presence, a central presence if not a commanding one, although one could almost say a commanding one by negation. If one feels compelled to refer all one's actions in relation to all significant post-Holocaust phenomena to Hitler, in the sense of how will such acts or stances affect Hitler's legacy, one comes close to submitting oneself to a putative Hitler's judgment. How would this or that act or stance make Hitler feel? Would Hitler consider it a posthumous victory if I chose X or Y? Hitler becomes, if not the ruling principle, then the ultimate referent. But in fact, when Fackenheim places the genesis of the 614th commandment in the specific context of his 1967 crisis of faith, in the context of post-Holocaust theodicy, of the impulse to demand that God explain Hitler in the face of the potential advent of a second Holocaust, the commandment can be seen as an inspired gesture of defiance, a kind of higher stubbornness, a repudiation of Hitler as ultimate referent. Higher stubbornness? I'd recast the impulse behind it this way. No, damn it, whatever I decide about the relationship between God and evil, between God and Jewish suffering, however unsatisfied I might be by other attempts to explain it, however much I might resent God's apparent silence or absence in the death camps, however much I reject the notion of some larger plan in which God required the murder of millions of children to accomplish some inscrutable end, however much I reject all the consolations and rationalizations of theodicy's attempt to explain Hitler, I refuse to allow Hitler the power, refuse to allow Hitler to be the catalyst, the defining issue over which I will reject the God my ancestors have lived with and died for better or worse, for 3,000 years. Reject God for any other reason, for non-existence, for silence, for death, but not for Hitler. Don't give Hitler that power, that posthumous victory. I'd come to Jerusalem saturated with the unanswered and perhaps unanswerable question of post-Holocaust theodicy, the arguments that put God in the dock after Hitler and Auschwitz. I was drawn to Yehuda Bauer's cleansing and logical syllogistic dismissal of God as Satan or Nebish, because it offered at least a resolution of a tormentingly unresolved issue. But finally, I found myself won over, not by Fackenheim's theodicy, but by what I sensed beneath the sophisticated Hegelian ratiocinations about radical evil, as a kind of sheer orneriness, the stubborn refusal to let Hitler be the judge in the trial of God. The 614th commandment as an article of faith. That was the only way for me, and still is, Fackenheim told me, to avoid the hopeless dilemma between not facing up to the Holocaust and having Judaism destroyed. Not facing up to the Holocaust. That is, not exempting God from questions of ultimate responsibility left unresolved by attempts to explain Hitler in human terms. Not having Judaism destroyed. Not finding God guilty, at least not in the first degree. not abandoning God or the Jewish way of worshiping him because of Hitler's evil. Fackenheim's 614th commandment is, then, if not a plea bargain, a limiting instruction to the jury. God can be found culpably negligent, but capital punishment is ruled out. There has to be another possibility than the death or execution of God, Fackenheim told me. If you face up to the Holocaust and say, "Oh, it's just another catastrophe," that is a blasphemy to the victims. The alternative, however, is blasphemy to the God so many of the victims worshipped. If you face up to it and the result is that Judaism is destroyed, because facing up to it might mean God is Satan, then it's a posthumous victory for Hitler. Some, like Rabbi Richard Rubinstein, suggest there is a third answer that combines continued love for the Jewish people, for Judaism in that sense, with rejection of the God who abandoned them to Hitler. But for Fackenheim, there was no middle way. That was the first thing I said at the 1967 symposium, Fackenheim told me. Before anything, he ruled out the ultimate guilty verdict on God, because it would make God Hitler's final victim. Issuing that limiting instruction resolved a personal spiritual crisis for him. The moment I said what I said, making that decision, the sickness left me, he said. Fackenheim stepped back from the brink, from where the logic of his critique of explanation was taking him. In George Steiner, we see someone who, out of either intellectual courage or recklessness, steps over it. Chapter 17. George Steiner, Singling Out the Jewish Invention of Conscience, in which a character named A.H. escapes from its famous literary creator, who is accused of playing with fire. It is, in a certain sense, a Frankenstein story, about a frightening creation that escaped from its creator. The creator is George Steiner, one of the foremost men of letters in the English-speaking world. His creation, a fictive character called A.H., who is transparently Adolf Hitler. George Steiner's Hitler began life as a figure in a literary fantasy, a sophisticated survival myth parable about a Hitler who'd escaped the bunker in 1945 and who, 30 years later, is finally tracked down, put on trial, and forced to defend himself, to explain himself. But something disturbing has happened with the Hitler in Steiner's fable. He explained himself far too well. He did more than escape the bunker, it seemed to some. He escaped Steiner. Even some of Steiner's most thoughtful supporters in the bitter controversy over Steiner's Hitler novel, The Portage to San Cristobal of A.H., believe that in some way A.H. escaped him. "It scared the hell out of me," Steiner himself told me, recalling the first time he came face to face with a living embodiment of the Hitler figure he'd created. The occasion was the opening of the London stage production of his novel. It was the first time Steiner saw his Hitler character in the flesh. Until then, his Hitler character was just the barest of initials on a page. Now, suddenly, A.H. was a charismatic, full-bodied, full-blooded figure bestriding the stage, mesmerizing an audience with words of self-justification Steiner put in his mouth. It was the first time he heard the applause. The dispute over the nature of that applause is a deeply disturbing one to Steiner, who has both an enormous scrupulosity about and an enormous distrust of the power of language, of the word. Toward the close of our conversation, in Steiner's Cambridge University study, I read him a quotation from an account in the London Observer of the play and the fierce controversy that surrounded the production, the pickets outside, the applause within. The Observer critic said the audience appeared to be applauding Hitler's speech in the play, the final epic soliloquy of self-justification Steiner had created for his Hitler character, the words that close the play. "Oh, no," said Steiner, horrified. "Oh, no, 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 no," he insisted 5 times. The applause was not for what Hitler said, he told me, but for the play as a whole, which ends a moment after Hitler's speech. In other words, they were applauding him, or the actors, not Hitler. Even assuming Steiner is correct about who the applause was for, he concedes he knows that the Hitler character he created might be dangerous, even on the page. He was aware of it, he told me, from the moment he put his pen down at the end of a 3-day sleepless fever dream of composition. He was aware of it, he told me, from the moment he put his pen down at the end of a 3-day sleepless fever dream of composition. He was aware he'd created an entity that needed to be controlled rather than unleashed indiscriminately upon the world. "The moment I finished it," Steiner told me, "I pledged to myself that neither in Hebrew nor in German would I allow it to be translated. I'm not going to have the Germans hear that in their own language." "Was it because you fear Hitler's speech could escape from its context?" I asked him. Yes, he said. "And it could be used. There have been pirated attempts in German, but they've been stopped," he said. "They've been stopped, but it's out there in circulation, however unauthorized. Steiner's Hitler speaking German to Germans, explaining himself, excusing himself, blaming the Jews for everything, including himself." The notion of a German edition of his Hitler is troubling to Steiner, but it doesn't seem to trouble him as much as seeing his Hitler in the flesh. And even more than the sight, it was the voice. Hearing his voice from the stage scared the hell out of him. There is something more dangerously potent to him about the voice, the word made flesh, than the word on the page alone. Perhaps it is because Steiner's lifelong horrified fascination with Hitler began at age 5 with the sound of Hitler's voice. The story of how one of the foremost Jewish intellectuals of the post-war era brought a Hitler figure to life, and how, Gollum-like, Frankenstein-style, this Hitler escaped to haunt him, begins with Steiner as a child, sitting in front of the radio, listening to that frightening, terrifying voice. "I was born in 1929, so from 33 on, my earliest memories are sitting in the kitchen hearing the voice of Hitler on the radio." The kitchen was in Paris. My father was from Czechoslovakia. He met my mother in Vienna. I was born in Paris. My father had left Vienna because he believed that Austrian anti-Semitism was going to explode one way or another. He couldn't have guessed it would be Mr. Schicklgruber that was coming, but he was always astonished that the Eastern European pogroms had stopped short of Austria. Austrian anti-Semitism seemed to be irremediable, as it is today. Paris proved to be no refuge. Steiner was 11 when his family had to flee France shortly before the Germans marched in. "By great good luck, we were able to get out with the last ship to sail from Genoa," one heading for the United States. What his father felt about Austrian anti-Semitism, Steiner felt about the French variety. It is very odd, given the Dreyfus affair, that the Holocaust, didn't happen in France. In some ways, it was ghastly bad luck for Germany that it could have happened in France. French anti-Semitism had a kind of systemic power and political profit which it didn't have in Germany. Had it not been for Hitler's quote-unquote peculiar genius, had there been a French Hitler, he might have had an even quicker ascent to power. "You don't agree with those who explain Hitler as somehow a product of the German soul?" I asked him. Not at all. On the contrary. German distaste about the vulgarity of Hitler's racism ran very, very deep. The Prussians never bought it. The Bavarians had their own particular case against him. They never bought it. In France, you can, at any time, get an explosion of French chauvinism against Jews. The Dreyfus affairs are French. The first plan to ship Jews to Africa did not originate in Germany. The Madagascar plan? French, Steiner says. If it was not the German soul, Steiner believes, there was something in the German language that peculiarly suited what he called Hitler's quote-unquote peculiar genius. He heard it in that voice on the radio. The overwhelming power was there, and the ease with which he got away with the Rhineland matter suggests a reading of the weakness of the West which was somnambular, that of a man who was a political genius. That word somnambular, suggesting a paradoxical state of unconscious consciousness, a mind both spellbound and spellbinding, Caligari-like, is a recurrent one in Steiner's description of Hitler. A Hitler who is a kind of medium for the evil genius of the German language itself. He speaks of Hitler's language being like antimatter to ordinary language. Yes, that's what my novel tries to show, among other things. It is antimatter. He is one of the greatest masters of the language, as are Martin Luther's pamphlets asking that all Jews be burned. German language has... all languages can have it, but in the German language, Hitler drew on a kind of rhetorical power which, in a way that is perhaps a little bit peculiar to German, allies highly abstract concepts with political, physical violence in a most unusual way. And Hitler was easily a genius at that, absolutely no doubt about it. The essence of the genius, Steiner insists, is not so much in the written word, but the embodied voice. It's a hard thing to describe, but the voice itself was mesmeric, he says, recalling the radio addresses. It was specifically the physicality rather than the metaphysicality that mesmerized, he told me. The physique is... the amazing thing is that the body comes through on the radio. I can't put it any other way. You feel you're following the gestures. Marshall McLuhan has a famous thesis that it, Hitler's charisma, wouldn't have worked on TV. I think that's balderdash. Hitler would have been the ultimate master on TV. All you need to look at is the Riefenstahl films of the rallies to see how he mastered every image, every gesture. The fascination and the distrust of speech, the love and hate for the power and terror of language, has been at the very heart of Steiner's remarkable career as literary prodigy and prodigal. After earning degrees from the University of Chicago and Harvard, and spending a stint at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study, he made a decision to return to England and the continent. He held dual professorships at Cambridge and the University of Geneva. The return was not casual. It was the fulfillment of a paternal injunction. It was my father's central resolution that I go back to Europe, he told me. Because, although there were wonderful opportunities in America, for my father, for me not to have come back would have meant that Hitler had won his boast that Europe would be Judenrein, Jew-free. And that he couldn't bear. There is something in this that echoes Emil Fackenheim's injunction to post-Holocaust Jews, his commandment that thou shalt not grant Hitler any posthumous victories. But there is also something very idiosyncratic in the way Steiner formulates it. For me not to have come back would be decisive, almost as if Hitler's posthumous victory or defeat would have been decided not by whether Europe was Jew-free, but whether or not it was Steiner-free. It's the kind of casual hubris that has made Steiner such a controversial figure, an intellectual provocateur who both dazzles and outrages. An admiring introduction to a book of essays about Steiner's work speaks of his greatness, the shocking massiveness of his learning, the prodigiousness of his competence in the major Western languages, the speculative power of his reflections, the brilliance of his textual commentary, the piercing eloquence of his prose, an oeuvre that, in its puissant majesty, is virtually without parallel. But this same commentator nonetheless acknowledges that an enormous amount of ill will toward him is harbored within the Anglo-American university community, because he can seem too vehement, hortatory, overbearing, he raises his voice in public, conventional academicians cannot forgive his polymathic virtuosity. How much Steiner's Jewishness enters into the resentment he engenders is a difficult question. The suspicion of some that his Jewishness had in the past denied him the honors in the Oxbridge academic community that his accomplishments should have commanded may be matched by the Oxbridge community's resentment of the implicit imputation of genteel anti-Semitism to it. But it cannot be gainsaid that Steiner's speculations are often designed to be not just vehement and hortatory, but profoundly provocative. Such is certainly the case with his assault on language and civilization itself, for its guilty implication in the Hitler horror, an assault that became the central theme of his work with the publication in 1967 of Language and Silence, and then in 1975 of After Babel, the nonfiction predecessor to his notorious Hitler novel. Both works raised the question of the potential diabolism within language itself, and implicitly addressed the relationship between Hitler and language. Did the evil of the Holocaust come into being because of Hitler's power to manipulate language to bad ends? Or was there something perverse, something demonic and Hitlerian, in the very essence of the language and the civilization built upon it? Something that expressed itself through Hitler. Steiner famously challenged the notion that language and culture were civilizing factors, with his image of a death camp guard reading great German literature and listening to great German music, and then proceeding to go out and stoke the great German crematoria. This issue can be found at the heart of some of Steiner's most daring and provocative speculations. Consider the suggestion he made to me about the way the language of Kafka might not only have foreshadowed, but somehow created Hitler. I'd been struck by something Steiner had written about Kafka's metamorphosis, that the word Ungeziefer, the word Kafka used in 1922 to describe the kind of insect poor Gregor Samsa found himself transformed into, was the very same word Hitler used to characterize Jews in his earliest speeches, vermin. Were you the first to point this out? I asked Steiner. Yes, that's in my very earliest work, he said. That's in Language and Silence. And it seemed to be, and I still don't know the answer to this, such as the exactitude of Kafka's foresight in The Penal Colony and The Metamorphosis, such as the authority, that it raises a ghastly question. Are prophecies self-fulfilling? I have no answer to that. That's an interesting idea. Do you mean? At a certain level, does a prophecy start engendering that which it is foreseen? He asks. Just by its presence in the world? You can't say Hitler read Kafka, obviously. No, of course not. He never heard of it. But it was there. It was suddenly there as a possibility. Kafka as a source of Hitler? As a source of the concentration camp world, of the world of the bureaucracy of murder. In Kafka's case, we're dealing with the single most powerful act of prophecy ever. Karl Kraus is the other. Karl Kraus, the Viennese literary satirist, says in 1909, "Soon in Europe they will make gloves out of human skin." That's 1909. And Kraus, another Jew on the margin, saw it absolutely clearly coming out of the Vienna situation. But with Kafka, Steiner is going further than asserting the kind of prophetic foresight he attributes to Karl Kraus. With Kafka, he's coming close to an almost black magic view of the dark power of words, that they have a spell-like power to bring into being that which had been inconceivable before they were uttered, something more radical than a prophetic relationship, a causal one. I don't think he believes literally that Kafka made Hitler possible. I think he's pressing a metaphoric correspondence to its limits, and the explicit parallels between Kafka's penal colony world and the death camp universe have been persuasively challenged by Lawrence Langer. But it is Steiner's need to see them that is most of interest. It is testimony to his awe and distrust of the power of language. It reflects his profoundly ambivalent attitude toward European civilization in relation to Hitler. Was Hitler a culmination of dark forces within European civilization, or an aberration from its values? I believe this is what is behind Steiner's touching preoccupation with Hitler's recess schedule in junior high school, and his obsession with the lost works of Viennese street photographers. I am the first to ask that we comb every photograph of Vienna, it hasn't been done yet, to see whether we by chance have him, Hitler, on a tramway or street with Freud and Mahler. Now remember, he also goes to the same school as Wittgenstein. Steiner is so obsessed with this connection that he's researched the recess hours of that school at Linz. Hitler and Wittgenstein were 2 years apart at school, but I have looked into this. At 11 or 11:15, as in all European schools, there's recreation. You go out in the yard and play. There's no doubt they were in the same yard. And I find it almost impossible to believe that on the Ringstrasse, in Vienna, he didn't cross the men I've named, Freud and Mahler. Of course he did. And it is conceivable that a street photographer, you know, with their big tripods and the thing over their heads, it's conceivable one captured them together. I wondered what could be the source, the point, of Steiner's peculiar fascination with the possibility that Hitler, Freud, Mahler, and Wittgenstein could be found on the same piece of photo paper or in the same recess yard. On reflection, I believe it has something to do with Steiner's uneasy wavering between the poles of that key divide in Hitler explanation literature, the divide between the aberrationist and culminationist camps. On the one hand, Steiner can call Hitler a singularity, an aberrant freak of human nature with a peculiar genius, but in Steiner's theoretical works he comes across as a culminationist, taking the darker view that Hitler was a product, the culmination of the dark side of European civilization, of the cursedness of language which underlies and shapes that civilization. In this view, the evil is in the word itself. Hitler is merely the somnambular medium that gave voice to it. Thus, Steiner's obsession with finding a photo that captures Hitler with such avatars of European thought as Wittgenstein and Freud. Seeing a Hitler who emerged from the same photo emulsion as these paragons of European and Jewish civilization would then symbolize, fix in silver nitrate, Steiner's vision of a Hitler who emerged from the same underlying matrix of culture that produced that civilization's highest achievements. Thus, the one is inseparable from the other. The fabric of the civilization that produced Wittgenstein is implicated nonetheless in the causation of Hitler. And so, when we imbibe the distillation of civilization's finest fruits, we are inevitably also drinking from a poisoned chalice. His preoccupation with the photo-emulsion image of Hitler, Steiner disclosed to me, was the source of what became his most notorious and controversial work, the novel in which he addressed the Hitler mystery most directly. A 1919 photograph of Hitler set him off, he says. That's the center of the novel, he says, that photograph. It's a real, albeit obscure photo, he says, that shows Hitler standing in the pouring rain like a beggar. It's 1919, I believe, when he was a discharged corporal without a penny, and nobody's even stopping as they hurry by on a Munich street corner. And a year later, 100 people stop, a few years later 10,000, and then 10 million, and this is something which I come back to and back to in my thinking. It is a terrifying proof of the omnipotence of the word, even if it is an anti-word. The notion of an anti-word comes from the same speculative vein in Steiner as the notion of Hitler's language as antimatter, fusing, perhaps too casually, concepts from ancient Kabbalistic legends and up-to-the-minute quantum physics. This was the sort of feverish speculation that gave rise, Steiner told me, to the fever dream in which he gave birth to the Hitler novel and the Hitler character, his Frankenstein creation. I was in Geneva, and it actually took only 3 days and nights. It was a single, total rush in which he wrote 2 things: Lieber's speech, an attempt to capture the hideous pathos of the death camp victims in maimed and fragmented sentences, and the speech of A.H., as his Hitler character is referred to in the text of the novel. Matter and antimatter. Why then? I asked him. Was there anything about the circumstances of his life that brought forth the fever dream of creation at that point? Possibly, a naive guess, he says with surprising candor. It could be that it was the point at which it became evident that my wife and children would be staying in our new home in Cambridge. She has an appointment, a professorship in history, here, and that we would have to explore the very difficult separate lives, and that may have triggered certain intensities. I wouldn't know, but it came in one extremely simple, it wrote itself. It wrote itself and then had its very complicated destiny. Before getting into that complicated destiny, by which Steiner means the fierce attacks on it and the Frankenstein-like escape of his Hitler character, let's look more closely at what Steiner actually wrote in that 3-day fever dream. Fever, in fact, in one form or another, infects the novel. Set in the feverish heat of the steamy, swampy rainforest, where almost all its characters become progressively infected with malaria and other worse forms of fever, it is a trek through the jungle that becomes a trek back into the fever dream of 20th century history. The Portage to San Cristobal of A.H. is a philosophical novel that makes use of a pulp fiction premise. Hitler is alive in South America. Hitler escaped the bunker, as the survival myth has it. He's been living comfortably in South America, but when he hears that a search team of Israeli Nazi hunters is on his trail, he flees to the depths of the rainforest. The novel opens with the Nazi hunter team catching up to him there, taking prisoner the frail, gray 90-year-old the Fuhrer has become, signaling their team leader back in civilization, in San Cristobal, that they're beginning the trek back out. But Hitler's too weak to walk, and his captors become too weakened with fever to carry him. Deep in a malarial swamp, eaten alive by infectious insects, they realize they'll never succeed in making it all the way back, in bringing him to justice. And so they decide that before they all die, they'll put Hitler on trial right there in the jungle. Meanwhile, their radio signal has been intercepted by various intelligence operatives of the Western powers who fought Hitler. In London, Sir Leslie Ryder, a caricature of Hugh Trevor Roper, is alarmed by the political problems a Hitler trial would cause. Curiously, Steiner has chosen to put into his Trevor Roper figure's mouth the characterization of Hitler favored by Trevor Roper's arch-rival, Alan Bullock. Sir Leslie specifically calls Hitler a mountebank, the very word Trevor Roper reviles as the symbol of what he believes was Bullock's original misapprehension of Hitler. Sir Leslie derides Hitler as actor to the end. That's the secret of him. The Hitler as cynic characterization, favored by Emil Fackenheim and Bullock, but rejected by Trevor Roper, who sees Hitler as unfeignedly possessed. Sir Leslie then wonders if the man found in the rainforest is the real Hitler, or, in a fiendishly ironic trick of fate, the look-alike double Hitler was alleged to have used on occasion for security purposes. The shadow, the mask of him, the Hitler actor rather than the actor Hitler. On the other hand, Emanuel Lieber, the commander of the Israeli team who is waiting at the San Cristobal base camp for their return, has no doubt it is the real Hitler they have. But he expresses less triumph than dread of Hitler's diabolical antimatter language. He radios his team to tell them whatever they do, don't talk to him, don't listen to him. Gag him if necessary, or stop your ears as did the sailor. If he is allowed speech, he will trick you and escape. Don't let him speak, Lieber repeats, citing the prophecy of a medieval Jewish sage. There shall come upon the earth in the time of night a man surpassing eloquent. All that is God's must have its counterpart, its backside of evil and negation. So it is with the word, with the gift of speech. But weakened by disease, near death, and fearing that if they all die, Hitler will never face justice, the team in the jungle decides to disobey Lieber's warning, to put Hitler on trial, to allow him to speak in his own defense. That speech, Hitler's own Hitler explanation, constitutes almost all of the final section of the novel. He speaks, this Hitler, with all the feverishly insidious fluency that Lieber had warned against, speaks with a force and a slippery fluidity that a summary can't convey, but the overriding theme is that whatever he was, whatever he became, he learned from the Jews. They, not he, are to blame for what he became and did. It's a theme that expresses itself in three variations. First, he insists he learned his racism, his notion of the master race, from the Jewish idea of the chosen people. He even points the finger at a specific Jew, a fellow flophouse denizen in Vienna named Jakob Grill, who, he claims, read him chosen people passages from the Bible that he merely adapted by substituting Aryan for Hebrew superiority. My racism was a parody of yours, he tells his Jewish captors, a hungry imitation. Second, he claims that in seeking to exterminate the Jews, he was not imposing his will upon the world, but expressing, carrying out the wishes of the rest of the world, with its willing collaboration. It was not just the Germans, but the whole world who wanted to erase the Jews, because the Jew invented conscience and left man a guilty serf, forever tortured by expectations he cannot meet. Expectations Hitler summarizes as the threefold blackmail of transcendence: the 10 Commandments of Moses, the Sermon on the Mount of Jesus, and the demands for social justice of Karl Marx. 3 Jews who tormented mankind with the demands of conscience, love, and justice. What were our camps compared with that? Hitler asks the jury in the jungle. Ask of man more than he is, hold before his tired eyes an image of altruism, of compassion, of self-denial which only the saint or the madman can touch, and you stretch him on the rack, till his soul bursts. What can be crueler than the Jew's addiction to the ideal? With Moses, Jesus, and Marx, 3 times the Jew has pressed on us the blackmail of transcendence. 3 times he has infected our blood and brains with the bacillus of perfection. Steiner's Hitler denies, then, that he is some singular demon of your rhetorical fantasies. He is not an aberration. You have made of me some kind of mad devil, the quintessence of evil, hell embodied. No, he says, he is rather a culmination of human wishes. How else could millions of ordinary men and women have found in me the mirror, the plain mirror of their needs and appetites? The slaughter could not have happened without their active and passive complicity. It was an ugly time, but I did not create its ugliness, and I was not the worst. Here he indulges in an excursion into exculpation through comparative evil, measuring himself against the slaughter of the Congolese by the Belgians, 20 million, he says, against the Boer War inventors of the concentration camp, and finally against Stalin. Our terrors were a village carnival compared with his. Hitler's final argument is that he was, in fact, serving as an instrument of the will of the Jewish God. He was not the destroyer of the Jews, but in fact their savior, because his war on them made possible the fulfillment of the messianic dream of the return to Israel. In fact, his most outrageous claim is that he, Hitler, might in fact be the promised Messiah. Finally, Hitler gives his summation. Gentlemen of the tribunal, I took my doctrines from you. I fought the blackmail of the ideal with which you have hounded mankind. My crimes were matched and surpassed by those of others. The Reich begat Israel. These are my last words. His last words. Part of the problem with this astonishing speech, and I should stress it's only one cause of the rage with which many reacted to it, is that these are not only Hitler's last words, but virtually the last words in the entire novel. There is one final full paragraph appended, in which a rainforest tribesman who has been a silent witness to the trial of Hitler leaps up, intending to cry out, "Proved!" The tribesman has not understood the words Hitler spoke, Steiner writes, but their brazen pulse carried all before it. In fact, the tribesman's cry never escapes from his mouth, so the last sounded word is in fact Hitler's. But assuming the tribesman did utter it, there's an ambiguity here. What is proved? Hitler's case for himself, or the case against him? In any event, Hitler's speech is followed not by any refutation, just the sound of helicopters descending on the clearing in which the trial has taken place. Are the copters there, as has been hinted, to silence Hitler, to execute him before he can become a terrible inconvenience to the former Allies by reminding them of their complicity in his rise, their complacency despite their knowledge of the death camp slaughter? Or have they come to convey Hitler back where his dangerously insidious words, his antimatter language, will once again have the power to seduce and destroy? The novel ends in mid-sentence with the helicopters descending. The only thing clear is that with the conclusion of the novel, the trial of Adolf Hitler had ended, and the trial of George Steiner had begun. The charges against Steiner were manifold and stinging, ranging from the artistic to the personal. First, it was said he'd allowed Hitler to have the last word. That long, insidious, subversive, and disturbing speech at the end of the novel is allowed to go unrefuted. While some of Steiner's defenders twisted themselves into exegetical knots trying to prove that the Hitler speech, like the speech of Satan in Milton's Paradise Lost, subverted, refuted itself, self-deconstructed, pulled the rug out from under its own rhetoric, if you looked closely at it, their efforts in this direction were undermined by Steiner's enigmatic silence on where he stood in regard to the Hitler speech. In fact, before speaking with him, I hadn't been able to find any published instance in which he made explicit his actual attitude toward the words he put in Hitler's mouth, much less adopted that defense. Despite the attacks on him and his work, which escalated into public picketing when the novel became a stage play, he would not use the defense of irony that he'd intended Hitler's speech to be self-subverting. And to some, even if he had, it wouldn't have been enough. To give Hitler even a semblance of cogency, of sophistication, was playing with fire, as Steiner's most penetrating critic, Chaim Maccabee, put it. In a world historically receptive to any anti-Semitic argument, however crude, to put in Hitler's mouth a powerful rationale for blaming the Jews, however ironically intended, was feeding the same fires that sent Jews up the chimneys of the death camps. The sharpest attacks of all insinuated that Steiner was not merely putting words in Hitler's mouth, but making Hitler his mouthpiece, that Steiner's Hitler was saying things about the Jews that Steiner himself believed. For a time after the publication of the book, This argument was carried on in small intellectual publications and Jewish journals. But when Steiner permitted the novel to be staged, when the actor Alec McCowan gave full-blooded persuasive voice to Steiner's Hitler's words, when audiences seemed to some to applaud Hitler and Jewish pickets chanted outside the theater, it became a public nightmare for Steiner. A Frankenstein nightmare. Some part of him clearly wondered whether he had in fact given birth anew to a posthumous Hitler that would haunt him, haunt Jews forever after, giving Hitler not just a posthumous victory, but a posthumous life. Some part of him must have feared that the fantasy in the novel, a Hitler who had escaped, had come true, although Hitler hadn't escaped until Steiner freed him, gave him voice again. A perverse fulfillment of the warning of one of his characters: if he is allowed speech, he will trick you and escape. I could sense Steiner's deep unease over the issue in his anguished denial that the audience at the London production had applauded Hitler and not his play. His quintuple, "No, no, 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 no!" And yet, I found to my surprise, he was willing to answer my questions about his Hitler quite frankly, more revealingly, I believe, than he ever had before. I put the question very directly. Can't the unanswered Hitler speech, the novel itself, be interpreted as blaming the Jews for Hitler's crimes against them? At first, he seemed to be distancing himself from that possibility with the "it's only a character speaking" ploy. It can be interpreted that Hitler would have defended himself this way. Suppose he hadn't shot himself. He's put in a glass box. And suppose his demonic power had been unleashed. In other words, Steiner was merely trying to extrapolate the reality of Hitler rather than put his own persuasive words into his mouth or endorse those words in any way. His use of the word demonic suggested to me that he might, in fact, be deploying the Milton's Satan defense of his Hitler speech. William Blake had argued provocatively that the dazzling heroic rhetoric Milton puts in Satan's mouth, in Book 1 of Paradise Lost, when a speech by Lucifer rallies his fellow fallen angels with romantic rhetoric of rebellion against tyranny, proved that Milton himself was of the devil's party. But the thrust of the 20th century critical response to Satan's speech was to attempt to prove that Milton had ingeniously devised Satan's rhetoric in such a way that, examined closely, it betrayed its own diabolical meretriciousness, that the reader was designed to first be seduced, to be surprised by sin, the title of an excellent early study of the question by Stanley Fish, only then to realize how the glittering surface of Satan's rhetoric had ensnared him, and, shocked by the nearness of his own fall, to emerge chastened and ever more alert to the danger of taking at face value the words of the devil. But when I gave Steiner the opportunity to avail himself of this defense, he refused the easy way out. The questions Hitler raises in his speech are valid, he told me. I think it calls for answers, he said. Hitler's speech calls for answers, he repeats, and he means answers from Jews. Consider the argument he puts in Hitler's mouth that the Jewish concept of the chosen people is the origin of the master race idea. Steiner defends the comparison. The 1,000-year Reich, the non-mixing of races, it's all, if you want, a hideous travesty of the Judaic. But a travesty can only exist because of that which it imitates. Almost refusing to hear Steiner's endorsement of the comparison, I kept offering him a way out from behind his Hitler. When Hitler calls himself Sabbatai, I began, referring to a passage in Steiner's Hitler's speech in which he invokes the name of the famous false messiah who deceived masses of Jews worldwide before recanting and converting to Islam. I thought that was an indication of, I was looking for irony in your view of Hitler. There is irony, Steiner says. Because of the Sabbatai's V figure then converting, and there's mockery there. But it's localized irony. He insists the questions his Hitler asks about the implication of the Jews in their fate must be taken seriously. I have demanded an answer to these questions and never got one, from his critics who condemned him for even asking. He insists on his right to ask and on the need to answer Hitler's questions. Hitler's questions or Steiner's questions? Perhaps the most revealing thing Steiner said came when he reiterated to me the need for answers. I don't think I even know how to answer what I say in that last speech, he told me. It wasn't until reading over the transcript of the interview that I realized I'd missed the import of that quote. I don't know how to answer what I say in that last speech. Not what Hitler says, what I, George Steiner, say. His Hitler speaks for him. He stands behind his Hitler's questions. There were many attacks on that speech, he says, but they attacked the very notion of raising the questions rather than answering them. And I want it to be answered, he insists, raising his voice. Where is the answer? Not just saying you're being an outrageous cretin for asserting such things. I'm still waiting for answers. I've debated its role often, including with Fackenheim, and no answers. He needed to malign me that I totally misunderstood the sense of God's election of the chosen people. And I then began quoting the book of Joshua and said to Fackenheim, "You really don't get it. I really want an answer." Struck by how impassioned he was, I asked him about the final, most outrageous question his Hitler asks. Wasn't he, Hitler, the Messiah who brought about the fulfillment of the messianic dream of a Jewish homeland in Palestine? We can show that the miracle of the recognition of Israel in 1948 is inseparable from the Shoah, Steiner replied. So my Hitler says, who created Israel? There wouldn't have been an Israel without the Shoah. I tried to get a sense of just how closely Steiner stands behind another assertion of his Hitler, that he was only embodying the animus of the world against the Jews, exterminating the Jews for the blackmail of transcendence, for torturing non-Jews with the invention of, the demands of, conscience. It seems pejorative, the phrase you use, I said, calling it the blackmail of transcendence. Is there something wrong with asking people to be better than themselves? No, he says, but they hate you for it. We hate no one as deeply as somebody who says we've got to do better and keeps saying it and rubbing it in, just rubbing our nose in our own failing. Oh, boy. Who do we hate most? Those who have been generous to us in a moment of weakness? Those who have seen us in abject need? And when we end up doing well, we will do anything not to look them in the eye again. It's hard to deny that this is a truth of human nature, that, as the saying goes, no good deed goes unpunished. But is Steiner endorsing the view that the Jews deserve to be punished for asking, in the persons of Moses, Jesus, and Marx, for an ethic of good deeds? Is transcendence something Jews should be apologetic for? I asked Steiner. On the contrary, he said, it's the highest. My God, if we could love our neighbors as ourselves, oh boy. But aren't you saying the inevitable product of positing this as an ideal is Hitler? Not just positing it, Steiner replied. The Jews were demanding it and demanding it, he said, once again sounding as if the Jews were to blame. Should we have demanded less, or... He sighed. Probably we should have done better by demanding it more of ourselves. Now, if Mother Teresa were sitting here, I'd shut up. She has the right to demand it. I've known human beings, very few, who have given up high careers to work on the Afghan border in the refugee camps, right? Or people in geriatric wards in New York, emptying the shit bowls at night, holding people shouting and shaking with drugs. These people have every right to say to me, "Why don't you do something more with your life?" In fact, they don't. The other ones that don't live those lives do demand it. And until you know that you can do far better, it is very difficult to ask it of others. And Judaism has asked it of others 3 times. Again, while Steiner insists these are questions he wants answers to, the way he frames the questions seems to suggest he knows the answers. Not that he likes the answers, but the answers do seem, if not to blame the Jews, then to implicate them in their fate. Here he seems to be saying that it's not so much the Jews' fault for demanding transcendence, but rather for the implicit hypocrisy of demanding it from others, without first sufficiently demonstrating it themselves. Jews don't always live up to the standards they set for everyone. Therefore, supposedly, we can understand why the world secretly approved when Hitler slaughtered them. Because of my admiration for Steiner's intellect and his art, I was reluctant to come around to his critics' view that he was, in his Hitler novel, devising sophisticated ways of blaming the victim.